The morning we left for the family gathering, I packed our navy blue SUV with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this dance 100 times before. Snacks sorted by preference and allergen status, entertainment devices charged and loaded with downloaded content, travel pillows distributed according to height and neck support needs. My husband Marcus loaded the cooler while I did one final check of our route on my phone, calculating rest stops and bathroom breaks with the efficiency of a military strategist. It was supposed to be straightforward. Drive 4 hours north to the lake house my aunt had rented for our annual summer reunion. Spend 3 days pretending to enjoy my cousin's famous but universally despised quinoa salad. Let the kids run wild with their second cousins. And return home with sunburns and the satisfaction of having fulfilled our family obligations for another year. The kids, Emma, 11, Jake, 8, and little Sophie, 6, were already settling into their respective territories in the back seat, establishing invisible boundaries with the ruthless efficiency of tiny diplomats. Emma had claimed the window seat behind me. Jake had positioned himself strategically in the middle with access to both cup holders, and Sophie had curled up behind Marcus with her stuffed elephant and a book she couldn't actually read yet, but carried everywhere anyway. "Everyone buckled?" I called back, adjusting the rearview mirror to get a better view of my small passengers. "Mom, Jake's looking at me," Emma announced with the weary tone of someone who'd been personally victimized by sibling proximity for far too long. "I'm not looking at you. I'm looking past you," Jake replied with the kind of technical precision that suggested a future in either law or professional argument. "Just try to coexist peacefully for the next 4 hours, I said, starting the engine. "We'll stop in 2 hours for lunch and leg stretching." Marcus climbed into the passenger seat, coffee in hand, wearing his standard road trip uniform of comfortable jeans and a t-shirt from some 5K run he'd completed 3 years ago. He was always the calm one during these family expeditions, the steady presence that kept me from spiraling into the kind of travel anxiety that made me check and recheck our luggage like I was preparing for an Arctic expedition instead of a weekend at a lake house. "Your parents seemed excited about this year," he said, buckling his seatbelt and settling back with his travel mug. I made a non-committal sound as I backed out of our driveway. My parents had seemed unusually enthusiastic about this reunion, which should have been my first red flag. They'd called twice in the past week to confirm we were coming, asked detailed questions about our departure time, and even offered to help with gas money, something they'd never done before, despite the fact that we always drove the farthest distance to these gatherings. But I'd been too busy with work deadlines and soccer practice schedules to pay attention to subtle shifts in their behavior. My mother had even volunteered to bring dessert for the entire group, another unprecedented gesture that should have had me asking questions. Instead, I'd been grateful for one less thing on my mental checklist. The first hour passed in relative peace. The kids settled into their individual activities. Emma lost in a fantasy novel, Jake absorbed in some handheld gaming device, and Sophie alternating between picture books and elaborate conversations with her stuffed elephant about the scenery we were passing. Marcus and I talked about work projects and weekend plans, the kind of comfortable domestic conversation that filled the space between destinations. Then, about 90 minutes into our journey, my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the dashboard display, and I answered through the car's speaker system. "Honey, I'm so glad I caught you before you got too far," she said, her voice carrying that particular bright quality that I'd learned to associate with requests I wouldn't want to fulfill. "We're making good time," I replied. "Should be there right around noon like we planned." "That's wonderful. Listen, I have a tiny favor to ask. Our car is absolutely stuffed to the brim. You know how your father overpacks. And we have this one additional bag that just won't fit. Would you mind terribly if we transferred it to your car? You have all that extra space in the SUV." I glanced at Marcus, who shrugged. It seemed reasonable enough. "Sure, that's fine. What kind of bag?" "Just a weekend bag. Nothing major. We can do the transfer when we meet up at the rest stop. You know, the one with the big gas station about an hour before the lake? We're planning to stop there anyway for coffee." "Okay, that works. See you there." After I hung up, Marcus looked over at me. "That's not like them," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Your parents, asking for help with logistics. Usually they're so..." He paused, searching for a diplomatic way to phrase it. "Self-sufficient." He was right, of course. My parents prided themselves on their independence, sometimes to a fault. They were the type of people who would drive with an overloaded car rather than admit they might need assistance, who would pack and repack their luggage obsessively to avoid having to ask anyone for help. The fact that they were suddenly willing to coordinate with us was unusual, but I chalked it up to age and perhaps a growing recognition that family cooperation might actually be easier than stubborn independence. We met them at the rest stop as planned. It was one of those sprawling travel centers with multiple gas stations, fast food options, and a convenience store that seemed to stock everything from phone chargers to fishing lures. My parents were waiting by their sedan, a mid-sized car that did indeed appear to be packed to capacity with luggage, coolers, and what looked like enough camping equipment for a month-long expedition. "There you are," my mother said, approaching with a smile that seemed just a little too bright for the occasion. She was wearing one of her travel outfits, comfortable but coordinated clothing that suggested someone who took family gatherings seriously as social events. My father emerged from behind their car carrying a large duffel bag, dark green canvas with leather trim, the kind of bag that suggested serious travel or perhaps military surplus. It looked heavy, the way he carried it, like it contained more than just clothes and toiletries. "This is it," he said, hefting the bag toward our SUV. "Really appreciate this, kiddo." I popped the trunk, and he loaded the bag carefully, positioning it between our own luggage with what seemed like unusual attention to placement. He made sure it was secure, testing it twice to ensure it wouldn't shift during the drive. "What's in there?" Jake asked, having emerged from the car to use the restroom and witnessed the bag transfer. "It looks heavy. Just some extra supplies for the reunion," my mother said quickly. "You know how these things are. You never know what you might need." Marcus and I exchanged glances. There was something in their demeanor, a kind of forced casualness that felt rehearsed. But we were in public. The kids were getting restless, and we still had 2 hours of driving ahead of us. It seemed easier to accept the explanation and get back on the road than to stand in a parking lot interrogating my parents about luggage contents. "No problem," I said. "We should probably get moving if we want to arrive on time." The second half of our journey started normally enough. The kids had recharged during the rest stop break and were initially energetic, pointing out interesting clouds and debating the relative merits of different billboards we passed. Marcus had switched to driving, and I was enjoying the passenger seat perspective, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to rural farmland, to the forested hills that surrounded the lake. But about 30 minutes after we'd left the rest stop, I noticed Marcus's posture changing. His hands gripped the steering wheel more tightly, and he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, not at the kids, but at something else. The trunk, I realized. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately, just continued to drive with that increasingly tense focus. Then, about 10 minutes later, he said something that changed everything. "We need to pull over." "What? Why? Are you feeling sick?" "No, just, we need to pull over. Soon." His voice carried a quality I'd rarely heard before, a combination of certainty and barely controlled anxiety that made my stomach clench. Marcus was not a person given to sudden decisions or unexplained urgency. In 12 years of marriage, I'd seen him remain calm through medical emergencies, work crises, and every variety of parenting challenge. The fact that he seemed genuinely shaken by something was more alarming than whatever that something might be. "There's an exit coming up," I said, studying the roadside signs. "It looks like it just leads to some back roads, but we can pull off there." "Good. Yes. Take that one." The exit ramp curved away from the highway and led to a 2-lane road that seemed to serve mostly agricultural traffic. We drove for a few minutes until Marcus spotted a wide shoulder near a field entrance where we could park safely without blocking any farm equipment. "Stay in the car for a minute," he said to me, then turned to address the kids. "We just need to check something quickly. Keep your seatbelts on." He got out and walked directly to the back of the SUV. I watched through the side mirror as he opened the trunk and began examining something. His body language was tense, methodical, like someone conducting an investigation rather than a casual inspection. After what felt like several minutes but was probably less than one, he closed the trunk and came to my window. "I need you to see this," he said quietly. "What is it?" "Just, please come look." I got out of the car, my heart rate climbing for reasons I couldn't yet articulate. The kids were starting to ask questions from the back seat, but Marcus reassured them we'd be right back. He led me to the rear of the SUV and opened the trunk again. Everything looked normal at first. Our luggage, the cooler, some beach toys for the kids, and the green duffel bag my father had loaded earlier. "Look," Marcus said, unzipping the duffel bag partially. I leaned in, not sure what I was supposed to be seeing. The bag appeared to contain clothes, as expected. T-shirts, shorts, what looked like swimwear. But as Marcus folded back a layer of clothing, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Nestled between the innocent vacation wear were several large plastic bags, each containing what was unmistakably not clothing, not toiletries, not anything that belonged in a family's luggage for a weekend reunion. The contents were packaged with the kind of careful sealing that suggested serious intent, and there was enough quantity to make it clear this wasn't for personal use. I stepped back from the car, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. They didn't. Marcus nodded grimly. I started getting suspicious about 20 minutes ago. Something about the way your dad handled the bag, the way they both seemed nervous during the transfer. So I pulled over to check. With the kids in the car, I whispered, the full implications hitting me like a physical blow. They put this in our car with our children. The next few minutes passed in a strange, suspended state, where I could hear my own heartbeat and feel the summer heat radiating off the asphalt, but everything else seemed distant and unreal. Marcus rezipped the bag and closed the trunk, and we stood there in the silence of the rural road, trying to process what we'd discovered. We can't go to the reunion, I said finally. No, we can't. We can't cross any state lines with this. No, we need to turn around. Yes. I got back in the driver's seat, my hands shaking slightly as I started the engine. The kids immediately began asking questions. Why had we stopped? Why were we turning around? Where were we going now? Change of plans, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We're going to head home. But what about the lake? What about seeing everyone? Emma protested. Something came up, Marcus said. We'll explain later. The drive home was one of the longest of my life, despite being shorter than our intended journey. My phone rang repeatedly. My parents, wondering where we were, whether we'd encountered traffic, if everything was okay. I didn't answer. Neither did Marcus. We just drove in tense silence while the kids gradually accepted that our weekend plans had been derailed by some adult crisis they weren't privy to. When we finally reached our neighborhood, instead of turning toward our own house, I found myself driving toward my parents' place. It felt automatic, inevitable, like the conclusion to an equation I'd been solving without realizing it. What are we doing? Marcus asked as I pulled into their driveway. Returning their property. Their house was a modest ranch-style home in a neighborhood that had been middle-class respectable when they'd bought it 30 years ago, but had since become a mixture of young families fixing up starter homes and older residents aging in place. My parents had always taken pride in maintaining their property. The lawn was meticulously edged, the driveway power-washed, the exterior painted in colors that suggested respectability without ostentation. I used the spare key they kept hidden under a decorative rock near the front porch, the same hiding place they'd used since I was a teenager. The house smelled like coffee, and the vanilla candles my mother bought in bulk from warehouse stores. Familiar scents that now felt contaminated by what I'd learned about them. We placed the duffel bag just inside the front door, neither of us speaking. It felt like depositing evidence, like leaving a message that didn't require words. Then we locked the door, returned the key to its hiding place, and drove home. That evening, after the kids were in bed and the house was quiet, my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen, and after several rings, I answered. "Where are you?" she asked without preamble. "Everyone's been worried sick. You just disappeared. We came home. But why? What happened? Is everything okay?" I let the silence stretch for a few seconds before responding. "We found your bag." The pause on her end was telling. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its frantic quality and taken on something more careful, more calculated. "I don't know what you think you found, but we left it at your house," I interrupted. "If it was so important, maybe you should have carried it yourself." Another pause. Then, "Honey, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "No," I said. "I don't think there has been. We can talk about this. We can explain." "No, we can't. Don't call us again." I hung up before she could respond, and Marcus and I sat in our living room, staring at each other across the coffee table that was still cluttered with the kids' art supplies and homework folders. All the normal detritus of family life that suddenly felt precious and fragile. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We protect our family," he said. "However we need to." The next few days passed in a strange bubble of normalcy. We told the kids that the reunion had been canceled due to a family emergency. which was technically true, though not in the way they understood it. We went through our regular routines: work, school, soccer practice, grocery shopping. But underneath the surface, everything felt different. My parents didn't call again immediately, but I knew they would. This wasn't the kind of situation that would just fade away through mutual avoidance. They would want to explain, to justify, to minimize. They would want to restore the status quo where their needs took precedence over everyone else's safety and peace of mind. I wasn't ready for that conversation, but I knew it was coming. It came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was working from home, trying to focus on a client presentation, when the doorbell rang. I looked through the front window and saw my parents standing on the porch, looking like they were making a social call rather than arriving to address a crisis of trust that had fundamentally altered our relationship. I stepped outside and closed the door firmly behind me, not inviting them in. "We need to talk," my father said. "No, we don't. You're being unreasonable," my mother added. "You don't understand the full situation." "I understand enough." "Do you?" my father asked. "Do you understand that we were desperate? That we'd exhausted every other option? That you'd already made it clear you weren't going to help us?" There it was, the deflection, the way they could take any crisis and somehow make it about my failures as a daughter. It was a pattern I'd been navigating my entire adult life, the way they could transform themselves from perpetrators into victims, by simply reframing the narrative. "You put my children at risk," I said. "We would never," my mother began. "You put illegal substances in our car," I continued. "With our kids, without our knowledge. You were willing to let us face the consequences if we'd been caught. It wasn't supposed to happen that way," my father said. "How was it supposed to happen?" Neither of them answered, which was answer enough. "We're done," I said. "Don't come here again. Don't call. You don't get to see the kids. This relationship is over." "You don't mean that," my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I mean it completely." I went back inside and locked the door, watching through the window as they stood on my porch for several more minutes, apparently waiting for me to change my mind, or at least continue the conversation. When it became clear that neither was going to happen, they finally left. That night, Marcus and I had the conversation I'd been dreading. "They're not going to give up," I said. "They're going to keep trying to contact us, to get to the kids, to wear us down until we give in. So what do you want to do?" "I want to leave." The words surprised me as I said them, but once they were out, I realized I'd been thinking about it for days. Not just avoiding my parents temporarily, but creating real distance, the kind that couldn't be bridged by unexpected visits or emotional manipulation. "Your company has been asking about the Denver office," I continued. "You said they'd been trying to fill positions there." Marcus nodded slowly. "It's still available. They've actually been pretty persistent about it. I want to take it." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." The decision, once made, felt liberating rather than frightening. We spent the next several weeks planning our move with the same methodical approach we'd once used for family vacations. We researched schools for the kids, found a realtor to handle selling our house, began the process of relocating our lives to a place where we could start fresh. The kids were initially resistant to the idea of moving, but they adapted with the resilience that children possess when the adults in their lives project confidence about major changes. Emma worried about leaving her friends, Jake was concerned about finding a new soccer league, and Sophie mostly wanted assurance that her stuffed elephant would be making the journey with us. We didn't tell my parents about the move. We didn't tell most of our extended family either. We simply began the process of extracting ourselves from the web of relationships and obligations that had kept us tethered to a place and people that no longer felt safe. 3 months later, we were in Colorado, living in a rental house with mountain views and neighbors who didn't know our family history. The kids were enrolled in new schools, Marcus was settling into his new position, and I was freelancing with clients who had no connection to our previous life. It was during this settling-in period that I learned what had happened after we left. My sister called from a number I didn't recognize, probably hoping I'd answer if I didn't immediately know it was family. "They were arrested," she said without preamble after I'd reluctantly answered. "Who was arrested?" "Mom and Dad, last week. They tried to cross the border with exactly what you think they tried to cross the border with." I sat down heavily in my new kitchen, looking out at the mountains that had become part of our daily view. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. They're being held without bail right now. The lawyer says they're looking at federal charges, Prison time, the whole thing. How much? How much what? How much were they carrying? Enough that the prosecutor is calling it trafficking, not just possession. I absorbed this information in silence, trying to reconcile the parents who had raised me. Flawed, certainly, prone to poor financial decisions and questionable judgment, but still recognizably the people who had taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework, with the reality of what they had apparently chosen to do. They need help, my sister continued. Legal fees, bail money when it becomes available, someone to coordinate with lawyers. You're the only one in the family with any resources. No. What do you mean, no? I mean no. I'm not helping. They're our parents. They made their choices. You can't just abandon family when things get difficult. They abandoned us first, I said. When they decided to use us as unknowing accomplices in their criminal activities, when they decided our children's safety was an acceptable casualty for their financial problems. That's not how they saw it. I don't care how they saw it. The conversation continued for several more minutes, but it was essentially a repeat of the same arguments from different angles. My sister believed in family loyalty above all else, that blood relationships created obligations that transcended individual actions or consequences. I had come to believe that family was something you created through trust and respect, not something you inherited through genetics. We ended the call without resolution, and I haven't spoken to her since. Over the following months, I occasionally heard updates through the extended family network that persists even when direct relationships have been severed. My parents eventually pled guilty to federal trafficking charges in exchange for reduced sentences. They each received 4 years in federal prison, with the possibility of release after serving 80% of their sentences if they maintained good behavior. Part of me, a part I'm not entirely proud of, felt vindicated by this outcome. It confirmed that my instincts about the seriousness of what they'd done were correct, that this wasn't some minor transgression blown out of proportion by my own sensitivity, but mostly I felt sad. Sad for the parents they could have been, sad for the grandparents my children would never know, sad for the version of our family that might have existed if different choices had been made along the way. The kids adjusted to our new life with remarkable adaptability. Emma joined the school newspaper and discovered a talent for investigative reporting that made me proud and slightly worried about her future ability to let sleeping dogs lie. Jake found a soccer league that was more competitive than his previous one and thrived under the challenge. Sophie started kindergarten in a school where no one knew she had once been the shy kid who hid behind her mother's legs at social gatherings. Marcus's work transition went smoothly, and he seemed relieved to be in an environment where his primary stress was professional challenges rather than family drama. We bought a house after a year of renting. A modest place with a large backyard where the kids could play, and we could host barbecues for the new friends we were slowly making. It was at one of these barbecues, about 18 months after our move, that someone asked about our extended family. It was an innocent question from a neighbor who was trying to make conversation, wondering if our parents ever visited and whether we missed being far from our family of origin. I found myself giving a simplified but truthful answer. We don't have much contact with my side of the family. It was better for everyone if we made a fresh start. The neighbor nodded understandingly, probably assuming some combination of ordinary family dysfunction and geographical preferences rather than the more dramatic reality. And that was fine with me. Our new life didn't need to be built on detailed explanations of our old one. That night, after the guests had gone home and the kids were in bed, Marcus and I sat on our back deck, looking at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than the ones we'd been able to see in our previous location. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Moving? No, never. Even knowing how it ended for them?" I considered this question seriously, because it was one I'd asked myself many times. "I regret that it came to this," I said finally. "I regret that they made choices that led to these consequences, but I don't regret protecting our family from being collateral damage in their bad decisions." Do you think they understand that? What they did to us? I don't know. And honestly, I don't think it matters anymore. Understanding doesn't undo the betrayal. It doesn't restore trust. It doesn't change the fact that they were willing to risk our children's future for their own immediate problems. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of our new neighborhood settling into nighttime quiet. It struck me that this was probably the first time in years that I'd been able to sit outside in the evening without feeling like I needed to be alert for some kind of family crisis or unexpected demand on my time and resources. "I'm proud of you," Marcus said eventually. For what? For having the courage to choose us over them. For prioritizing our family's safety over their expectations. It couldn't have been easy. He was right. It hadn't been easy. Despite everything they'd done, despite the clear evidence of their willingness to use us for their own purposes, there was still a part of me that felt guilty for cutting them off so completely. I'd been raised to believe that family forgiveness was infinite, that love meant accepting people regardless of their actions, that loyalty was a virtue that transcended personal boundaries. But I'd learned, perhaps later than I should have, that love without boundaries isn't actually love. It's enabling. And loyalty that doesn't protect the most vulnerable members of your family isn't virtue. It's complicity. Now, 3 years after our move, our life has settled into rhythms that feel sustainable and healthy. The kids are thriving in their schools and activities. Marcus has been promoted twice and genuinely enjoys his work. I've built a freelance business that allows me flexibility while still contributing meaningfully to our household income. We've made friends who know us as we are now, not as we were shaped by our family history. We've created traditions and routines that reflect our values rather than inherited expectations. We've built a life that feels authentically ours, rather than something we're performing for an audience that was never satisfied anyway. Sometimes I wonder what my parents' lives would have looked like if they had made different choices, if they had chosen stability over schemes, honesty over image management, genuine connection over manipulation. But those are questions without answers. And I've learned that spending too much time on hypothetical scenarios is a form of self-torture that serves no constructive purpose. What I know for certain is this. The decision to prioritize my immediate family's safety and well-being over my extended family's demands was the right one. It was difficult, it was painful, and it required me to redefine my understanding of loyalty and love. But it was right. The morning we turned the car around instead of crossing that border, Marcus saved us from consequences we couldn't have anticipated. But the real salvation happened in the weeks and months that followed, when we chose to build something new, rather than continue repairing something that was fundamentally broken. Our children are growing up in a home where trust is expected and protected, where love is demonstrated through actions rather than just words, where their safety is non-negotiable rather than something that can be compromised for adult convenience. They will never have to wonder whether the people who claim to love them are willing to sacrifice their well-being for their own gain. That, I think, is worth any amount of distance, any degree of family disapproval, any level of guilt or second-guessing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. Sometimes protecting your family requires you to redefine what family means. Sometimes the bravest choice is the one that looks like abandonment to people who were never truly invested in your welfare anyway. I don't know if my parents understand any of this. I don't know if they've used their time in prison to reflect on the choices that led them there, or if they've constructed elaborate narratives that cast them as victims of circumstances beyond their control. What I know is that we are safe, we are happy, and we are free to build the kind of family we want to be, rather than perpetuating the kind of family we inherited. And that, finally, feels like home.